The thick wedding invitation bent slightly in my hand when my daughter said, "You're not welcome." As I set it on the desk, I kept my voice calm, even as something in me hardened. While the paper pressed flat beneath my fingers, I realized how easily a father can be erased. The same weight followed me into the venue office. Quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. That's when I understood respect isn't given. It's enforced when silence fails. Still, holding that invitation, I made one visit that ensured the ceremony wouldn't start without me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. Cream-colored, thick, expensive to the touch. Daniel Richards recognized Isabel's handwriting instantly. Precise, controlled, no wasted motion. He stood in his home office longer than necessary before opening it, as if instinct already warned him that whatever was inside would land heavier than paper ever should. The invitation itself was flawless, embossed lettering, elegant fonts, the name of a prestigious venue tucked into the corner like a quiet flex. For a moment, Daniel felt something dangerously close to pride. His daughter was getting married. Then his phone buzzed. Isabel's name lit the screen. "Before you read too much into it," she said, her voice flat, rehearsed, "I need to be clear. You're not welcome at my wedding." The words didn't land all at once. They spread slowly, like a fracture crawling through glass. Daniel said nothing. He waited for clarification, a correction, some sign. This was a cruel misunderstanding. None came. "I just thought you should know," Isabel continued. "I don't want a scene. I don't want complications." When the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair and stared at the invitation again. Same date, same time, same daughter. But suddenly, it felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Shock gave way to memory. Arguments that never fully ended. Conversations where Isabel had smiled politely while pulling further away. He remembered paying for her education, advising her career moves, questioning her choices not out of malice, he had always believed, but concern. Somewhere along the line, concern had turned into control. Or at least, that's how she saw it. He had felt the distance growing for years, but he never imagined it would end like this. Exile, delivered calmly, as if he were a distant relative instead of her father. That evening, he told Carla. She listened quietly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor between them. When he repeated Isabel's words, "You're not welcome," Carla flinched as if struck. "She's angry," Carla said carefully. "She's been angry for a long time." "So that's it?" Daniel asked. "I'm erased?" Carla shook her head, but her hesitation hurt almost as much as Isabel's rejection. She loved them both. He knew that, but loving both had left her stranded in the middle, exhausted from years of emotional negotiations that never truly worked. She didn't defend Isabel outright. She didn't defend him either, and that silence felt like another loss. Later that night, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He would still attend the wedding. Not as a guest, not as the apologetic father begging for scraps of inclusion. He would be present in a way that couldn't be ignored, not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. Across town, Isabel moved through her wedding plans with forced efficiency. Seating charts, floral arrangements. Jack tried to keep things light, cracking jokes, offering opinions she mostly dismissed. When he asked carefully if she was sure about excluding her father, Isabel shut the conversation down immediately. She told herself this was about peace, about finally having one day that wasn't shaped by Daniel's expectations. She didn't know he was already planning to step into the margins of that day. 2 days later, Daniel drove out to the venue. The estate was exactly as advertised: manicured grounds, stone arches, money woven into every detail. Michael Hayes, the owner, greeted him warmly. They had history, business overlap, mutual favors quietly exchanged years ago. Daniel smiled, shook hands, and spoke only of logistics at first. Guest flow, ceremony, timing, vendor access. Reasonable questions, harmless ones. But beneath the polite nods and professional tone, something else was forming. Daniel asked about policies, contracts, authority. What happened if complications arose? Michael answered, unaware he was being measured. each response slotting neatly into a growing framework Daniel had already begun to construct. When Daniel finally left the office, dusk settling over the property, his reflection stared back at him from the windshield. Not angry, not frantic, focused. For the first time since the call, he felt calm. He had spent too long being quiet, too long swallowing disrespect in the name of family harmony. Isabel had drawn a line. Now he would respond not with words, but with presence. And as the gates of the venue closed behind him, Daniel knew this wedding would not unfold the way his daughter believed it would. The gravel crunched softly beneath Daniel's tires as he pulled into the venue's circular drive for the second time that week. Morning light spilled across the manicured lawns, turning the estate into something staged, almost unreal. Weddings thrived on illusion, Daniel thought. Control the setting, and people believed the story you wanted them to see. Michael Hayes met him inside the main office, sleeves rolled up, posture relaxed but alert. He was a man who read contracts the way other people read faces. Daniel had always respected that about him. "Good to see you again," Michael said, gesturing toward a leather chair. "I assume we're here to finalize a few details." "Just that," Daniel replied, settling in. His voice was even, professional. No trace of emotion. He'd learned long ago that calm, unnerved people more than anger ever could. They reviewed timelines first. Ceremony start times, vendor access windows, backup plans in case of weather. Michael spoke smoothly, confidently, like someone accustomed to clients who needed reassurance. Daniel nodded, asked practical questions, played the role expected of him. Then, gradually, he shifted. "What happens?" Daniel asked casually. "If there's a dispute? Family, related, something unforeseen." Michael paused for half a beat. "We have protocols. Most situations are resolved quietly. And if they're not?" Michael leaned back slightly. "We rely on contractual authority. Whoever holds it." Daniel tapped a finger against the desk, thoughtful. "Authority matters," he said, "especially when emotions run high." Michael offered a polite smile, but his eyes sharpened. "Is there a concern I should be aware of?" "Not yet," Daniel replied. "I prefer to understand the boundaries before I test them." The room felt smaller after that. Michael began explaining policies in more detail, who could approve changes, who could halt proceedings under specific conditions. His tone stayed professional, but caution crept in around the edges. Daniel listened closely, committing every word to memory. As Michael spoke, Daniel's thoughts drifted backward. He remembered the first deal they'd done together years ago, a quiet investment that had saved the venue during a lean season. No press releases, no favors asked outright. Just understanding. Since then, their relationship had existed in that unspoken space where obligation and respect overlapped. "I've always valued how you handle things," Daniel said. Discreetly, Michael studied him now, openly wary. "This wedding means a great deal to your daughter." "I'm aware," Daniel replied, "which is why I want everything done properly." There it was. Not a threat, not a request, something heavier. Michael felt it settle between them like a weight he hadn't agreed to carry, yet somehow already was. "I can help within reason," Michael said carefully, "as long as we stay within the framework." Daniel met his gaze. "Of course. Frameworks exist for a reason." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, measured. Michael exhaled, nodding once. He didn't know exactly what Daniel intended, but he understood enough to realize refusal might complicate things far beyond one wedding. He agreed to remain flexible. When Daniel stood to leave, Michael walked him to the door. "I hope this doesn't become something bigger than it needs to be," Michael said. Daniel offered a faint smile. "That depends on how much resistance there is." Outside, the air felt cooler. Daniel crossed the grounds slowly, listening to the distant sound of staff preparing for an event meant to celebrate unity. He felt no guilt, only clarity. He drove away knowing something important had shifted. He now understood the structure behind the spectacle, the levers no one talked about, and more importantly, he knew Michael did too. As the estate disappeared in his rearview mirror, Daniel's thoughts returned to Isabel, to the years of conversations that ended without resolution, to the gradual erosion of respect that had led her to believe she could erase him from one of the most important days of her life. He hadn't planned this weeks ago. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but distance had hardened into defiance. and defiance demanded response. By the time he reached the highway, Daniel felt certain of one thing. Whatever happened next, the wedding was no longer entirely hers. As the wedding day crept closer, Daniel Richards moved through his house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Invitations sat unopened on the kitchen counter. A garment bag hung untouched in the closet. He told himself it didn't matter, that this distance was chosen, not imposed. Still, the silence pressed in at odd moments, while shaving, while driving, while standing in rooms that once echoed with his daughter's voice. Carla tried again, and again. She left messages for Isabel that went unanswered, sent texts that showed as read but never replied to. When she finally reached her, it was brief and brittle. Isabel didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Dad won't be there," she said firmly. "That's not changing." Carla closed her eyes as the call ended, grief tightening her chest. She wanted to argue, to plead, but years of walking this emotional tightrope had taught her when pushing only made the fall worse. That night, she told Daniel what Isabel had said. He nodded, absorbing it without reaction, as if the confirmation settled something already decided. Across town, Isabel drowned herself in details. Seating charts were revised for the third time. Flowers arrived in the wrong shade. A vendor ran late. Each minor problem felt personal, like the universe itself was testing her resolve. Jack tried to help, offering solutions, jokes, patience. But patience wore thin when it was always one-sided. "You don't get it," Isabel snapped when he suggested taking a break. "This has to be perfect." Jack didn't argue. He rarely did anymore. He felt caught between a woman determined to prove her independence and a man determined not to disappear quietly. And standing in the middle meant absorbing the impact from both sides. Daniel, meanwhile, focused on precision. He reviewed timelines, rehearsed conversations that might never happen, refined details no one else would notice. He wasn't attending the ceremony, that much was clear. But absence didn't mean invisibility. He understood systems, structures, pressure points. He had built his career on knowing where influence lived and how quietly it could be applied. Late one night, doubt crept in. He sat alone in his study. Lights dimmed. The invitation still tucked inside a drawer. He imagined the fallout. Isabel's fury. Carla's heartbreak. The permanent shift this could cause. He asked himself, not for the first time, whether restraint would be the wiser choice. Whether swallowing this humiliation might preserve what little relationship remained. But then he remembered the phone call, the calm dismissal in Isabel's voice, the finality of being told he was not welcome in his own daughter's life. No, silence had already cost him too much. Jack made one last attempt at peace. He called Daniel, voice tight with effort, choosing his words carefully. He spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how emotions ran high before weddings. Daniel listened politely, thanked him for calling, and offered nothing in return. Jack hung up knowing he'd failed, unsure whether he'd just watched a collision approach without the power to stop it. The day before the ceremony, Daniel drove back to the venue. Michael Hayes greeted him with forced ease, the weight of their last conversation still lingering. They spoke briefly, efficiently. No small talk, no pleasantries. Daniel confirmed timings, access points, contingencies. Michael answered each question, aware now that every response mattered. "This stays discreet," Michael said finally. "More statement than request." "It always does," Daniel replied. As Daniel walked back to his car, staff moved around him, setting up chairs, arranging flowers, rehearsing perfection. The air buzzed with anticipation, with optimism that felt almost fragile. He paused, taking it in, knowing how easily it could fracture. That evening, Isabel stood in front of a mirror, dress hanging behind her, heart racing with equal parts excitement and unease. Jack watched her quietly, wondering what storm still waited beneath the surface. And miles away, Daniel Richards checked his watch, calm and resolved. The countdown was almost over. Daniel had always told himself he was a good father. That belief began to unravel the night he sat alone in the dark, replaying moments he'd long dismissed as discipline or guidance. Isabel at 12, insisting on choosing her own classes. At 16, arguing about curfews. At 22, pushing back against his advice on her first job. Each time, Daniel had responded the same way, firm, confident, certain he knew best. He had called it protection. Isabel had called it suffocation. What he had mistaken for rebellion, he now recognized as resistance. A child learning how to breathe under the weight of a father who never loosened his grip. The realization didn't soften him. It sharpened him. Because even now, even after years of distance, Isabel hadn't just set a boundary. She had erased him. And that, Daniel couldn't accept quietly. He decided he would go to the venue just before the ceremony began. Not as a guest, not as a spectacle. His presence alone would be enough. He understood timing, impact. He had built entire negotiations around arriving at the exact moment someone believed they were in control. Carla sensed the shift before he said anything. She watched him button his shirt that morning with methodical calm, the kind that came before irreversible decisions. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, not pleading, just tired. "I do," Daniel replied. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. She had spent too many years standing between them, absorbing the damage from both sides. She loved Isabel. She loved Daniel, and she knew stopping him now would only fracture something else. "I just wish it didn't have to be like this," she whispered. "So do I," Daniel said, and for the first time, he meant it without qualification. Across town, Isabel moved through her morning with a confidence that bordered on relief. Her father wasn't coming. That certainty anchored her. Whatever else went wrong today, that problem was solved. She laughed with her bridesmaids, corrected makeup details, ignored the tightness in her chest whenever someone mentioned family. Control felt close, achievable. She had no idea it was already slipping. Daniel rehearsed his words on the drive. Not out loud, internally, calm, precise. He didn't intend to beg or threaten. He intended to remind Michael Hayes of agreements, obligations, influence. He would speak as a man accustomed to being heard, the way he always had. Michael, meanwhile, waited in his office, checking his watch more often than necessary. He'd hosted hundreds of weddings, managed last-minute disasters, smoothed over family conflicts. This felt different. Daniel Richards wasn't emotional. He was deliberate, and deliberate men rarely acted without consequence. The venue buzzed with energy as the hour approached. Staff moved faster. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Michael stood by the window, watching cars arrive, wondering which would carry the problem he couldn't quite define yet. Daniel pulled into the drive and shut off the engine. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing evenly. He thought of Isabel as a child, running across this same kind of open space. Hair loose, laughter unguarded. He wondered when exactly love had turned into power, and when power had turned into distance. Then he stepped out of the car. Inside the estate, Michael straightened his jacket as the front desk alerted him. "He's here," the attendant whispered. Michael nodded once, heart beating faster than he liked. Elsewhere, Isabel adjusted her dress, smiling at her reflection, certain of the day unfolding exactly as she planned. And in the quiet corridor leading to Michael Hayes' office, Daniel Richards walked forward, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Michael Hayes closed the office door himself. That alone told him this meeting wasn't routine. Daniel stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the estate as if he owned it. The ceremony was less than an hour away. Guests were arriving, music rehearsed faintly in the distance. Everything about the day was designed to move forward without interruption. Daniel turned slowly. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just need to settle something personal." Michael gestured for him to sit, but Daniel remained standing. That choice wasn't accidental. Power, Daniel knew, was often communicated through posture long before words were spoken. "You mentioned boundaries last time," Daniel continued. "Frameworks." Michael nodded cautiously. "Yes." Daniel reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the desk. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. "I've reviewed the contract," Daniel said. "Every amendment, every contingency clause, including the one tied to financial underwriting." Michael's throat tightened. He knew exactly which clause Daniel meant. A rarely invoked provision tied to initial capital contributions money Daniel had quietly fronted years earlier when the venue nearly collapsed. At the time, it had seemed harmless, a safety net. No one ever expected it to be pulled. "What are you saying?" Michael asked. Daniel finally sat down, calm, centered. I'm saying that under very specific conditions, this ceremony can be halted, temporarily, legally. The word halted landed hard. Michael stared at him. You'd shut down your own daughter's wedding? I'd pause it, Daniel corrected, until a conversation happens. Silence stretched. Outside, laughter drifted through the open grounds, unaware of the pressure building inside this small office. You can't do this lightly, Michael said. There are consequences. I'm aware, Daniel replied. I've spent my life managing them. Michael stood and walked to the window, jaw tight. Why? He asked finally. Why now? Daniel's expression didn't change, but something darkened behind his eyes. Because my daughter decided I no longer exist. Because she thought erasing me would be easier than facing me. He exhaled slowly. I'm not here to ruin her day. I'm here to be acknowledged, to be heard. Just once. Michael turned back. You're forcing a confrontation. Yes, Daniel said. I am. The admission hung between them, stark and undeniable. I know I've been controlling, Daniel continued, quieter now. I know I pushed when I should have listened, but cutting me out entirely, telling me I'm not welcome in her life, that's not independence, that's punishment. Michael rubbed his temples. He saw the trap clearly now. If he refused, Daniel could invoke the clause anyway, publicly, chaotically. If he agreed, he became complicit in a private reckoning that could explode without warning. You're asking me to help you corner your daughter, Michael said. I'm asking you to help me stop pretending this family can survive silence, Daniel replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Michael weighed reputation against risk, lawsuits against leverage, and beneath it all, the unmistakable reality that Daniel Richards was not bluffing. Finally, Michael nodded once. I'll delay proceedings if necessary, he said carefully, but I won't escalate. Daniel stood, collecting the folder. That won't be necessary. Michael's voice dropped. When? Daniel glanced at his watch. Soon. As Daniel moved toward the door, Michael stopped him. What if she refuses to see you? Daniel's hand rested on the handle. Then she'll understand something she's forgotten, he said without turning. That choices have consequences. The door closed softly behind him. Outside, the venue buzzed with anticipation. Guests took their seats. Music swelled. Somewhere inside, Isabel laughed, convinced the hardest part of the day was already behind her. And Michael Hayes remained frozen in his office, staring at the door Daniel had just walked through, knowing the ceremony was now balanced on a single, fragile condition, one that could collapse at any moment. The ceremony began without Daniel Richards ever stepping into view. From a quiet corridor just off the main hall, he watched the first guests take their seats through a narrow pane of glass. Soft music filled the space, carefully chosen to signal warmth, unity, beginnings. Daniel felt none of it. What he felt instead was awareness, sharp, controlled, deliberate. The machinery was in motion now, but it wasn't running freely. Not anymore. He knew his interference had already altered the day, even if no one else sensed it yet. Carla sat near the front, hands folded too tightly in her lap. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to look like a mother attending her daughter's wedding rather than a woman bracing for emotional impact. Her eyes drifted toward the entrance more than once, half expecting Daniel to appear despite everything. He didn't. That absence unsettled her more than his presence ever had. She still clung to a fragile hope that somehow this would resolve quietly, that the damage could stop here. Isabel stood at the back, bouquet trembling slightly in her grip as final adjustments were made. She smiled when someone spoke to her, nodded when necessary, reassured herself that this moment belonged to her alone. Her father wasn't coming. That certainty steadied her. Whatever tension she felt, she blamed on nerves, not knowing it was something else, entirely, something structural, unseen, waiting. Jack felt it first. As he took his place at the altar, he noticed the way staff members moved with a strange restraint, how whispers stopped abruptly when he passed. He scanned the room instinctively, searching for a familiar figure he didn't actually expect to see. Daniel's absence should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt deliberate, calculated. Jack's stomach tightened with a sense he couldn't articulate. Michael Hayes stood near the side entrance, headset tucked discreetly behind his ear, eyes never fully resting. He gave quiet instructions, adjusted minor details, smiled when spoken to. Outwardly, everything appeared seamless. Internally, he counted contingencies, time, triggers. The clause sat like a loaded mechanism in his mind. He knew exactly how quickly this could unravel. Daniel remained still. He didn't need to see Isabel walk down the aisle. He already knew what she would look like, composed, resolute, convinced she had finally taken control. He told himself this wasn't about spectacle, it was about correction, about reminding her and everyone else that erasure wasn't consequence-free. As the officiant stepped forward, Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He felt detached in a way that surprised him. No racing heart, no regret, only resolve. Whatever came next would define him, how he was remembered, how his authority settled into legacy. He had spent decades refusing to be sidelined. He wasn't about to start now. Carla glanced toward the side of the room, unease growing. She caught Michael's eye briefly and saw something there she didn't like. Not panic, preparation. Her throat tightened. Isabel took her first step forward, music swelling as planned. She didn't see Michael subtly check his watch. She didn't notice a staff member pause, awaiting instruction that hadn't yet come. She saw only Jack, waiting for her, and the life she believed she was stepping into unburdened. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He knew the confrontation, when it came, would be brutal, public, unforgiving. But he believed still that it was necessary. Silence had failed. Distance had failed. This was the only language left. Michael shifted his weight, fingers brushing the edge of his tablet, aware that a single signal could change everything. The vows had not yet begun, and, somewhere between the music and the first spoken word, the ceremony hovered balanced, fragile, waiting for the moment when the silent battle would finally surface. The moment came not with shouting, but with hesitation. The officiant had just begun to speak when Michael Hayes stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral but his body tense. He leaned toward Isabel, lowering his voice, choosing his words with surgical caution. Whatever he said, it drained the color from her face in seconds. "What do you mean, delayed?" Isabel whispered sharply. Michael straightened. "There's a contractual issue that needs immediate resolution," he said, loud enough now for nearby guests to hear. "Your father has invoked a clause that requires his presence before the ceremony can proceed." The room stilled. Conversations died mid-breath. Isabel's chest tightened as understanding crashed into her. Heat flooded her face, anger, humiliation, disbelief colliding all at once. She turned, scanning the room wildly until her eyes found him. Daniel stepped forward from the side aisle, calm, composed, dressed not for celebration but for purpose. The sight of him there, uninvited, unmoved, felt like an invasion. "You did this?" Isabel demanded, her voice cracking as it rose. "You couldn't let me have one day without you controlling it?" Murmurs rippled through the guests. Phones lowered. Faces sharpened with curiosity and shock. Daniel met her gaze evenly. "I needed you to hear me," he said. "You made sure I had no other way." "This is manipulation," Isabel shot back. "You're hijacking my wedding because you can't stand being told no." "I'm forcing accountability," Daniel replied. "You don't get to erase me and call it independence." The words landed like blows. Isabel laughed once, bitter and sharp. "You've been erasing me my entire life. Every choice I made came with your approval or your punishment." Carla rose halfway from her seat, hands trembling. "Please," she whispered, though no one heard her over the rising tension. Daniel took a step closer, careful not to touch. "I pushed because I believed I was protecting you," he said. "But shutting me out completely? Telling me I don't belong in your life anymore? That's betrayal." Isabel's eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. "You don't get to decide when I'm allowed to breathe," she said. "You don't get to punish me for choosing my own life." Jack stood frozen near the altar, watching the woman he loved unravel in front of dozens of people. He wanted to intervene, to say something that might diffuse the moment, but every word felt too small. "This was supposed to be my beginning," Isabel continued, her voice shaking now. "And you turned it into another test I can never pass." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't come here to ruin you," he said quietly. "I came here because silence was killing what was left of us." Carla finally stood, tears streaming freely. "Stop," she pleaded. "Both of you. Please." Neither listened. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others watching with undisguised fascination. What should have been vows and celebration had become something raw and unfiltered, a family reckoning with no exit. Michael stepped forward cautiously. "We need to pause," he said, "until this is resolved." Isabel turned back to her father, voice dropping to a furious whisper that carried anyway. "You think this makes you right?" "No," Daniel answered. "I think it makes you face me." Silence fell again, heavier than before. The ceremony had fractured beyond repair. The music had stopped. The illusion was gone, and as Isabel stood there, humiliated and furious, and Daniel stood unyielding in front of her, one truth became unavoidable to everyone watching. Whatever happened next, this family would never be the same. The officiant never finished his sentence. Michael Hayes raised a hand, subtle but decisive, and the staff responded immediately. Music faded. Guests were gently asked to remain seated. What had begun as a celebration was now unmistakably paused officially, unmistakably halted. There would be no vows. Not yet. Perhaps not at all. Isabel stood frozen for a moment, chest heaving, eyes scanning the faces around her. Pity, shock, curiosity. Every expression felt like an accusation. The weight of it became unbearable. "This isn't over," she said, voice breaking as she looked at Daniel one last time. Then she turned and walked away, heels striking the floor, with sharp, angry rhythm, as she disappeared down the corridor, meant for bridal photos, not escape. The room erupted into murmurs. Jack followed immediately, calling her name, his voice low and urgent. He found her near the service hallway, hands braced against the wall, shoulders shaking. He reached for her, but she pulled away. "Don't," she snapped. "Just don't." "I'm here," Jack said. "We can fix this. We'll talk to him. There is no fixing this," Isabel cut in. Tears streamed freely now. "He humiliated me, in front of everyone, just like he always does." Jack swallowed, helpless. Every instinct told him to protect her, but there was nothing he could say that would undo what had just happened. The damage was public, permanent, and Isabel's rage left no room for comfort. Back inside, Carla sat heavily in her chair, as if the strength had drained from her all at once. She pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes locked on the aisle where her daughter had stood moments ago. She had imagined this day for years, not perfection but joy. Instead, she had witnessed something break in real time. She approached Daniel slowly, voice trembling. "Did it have to be like that?" Daniel didn't look away from the empty space Isabel had left behind. "She wouldn't listen any other way," he said. "That was her wedding," Carla whispered. "You took something from her she can never get back." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his expression remained controlled. "She took something from me first," he replied. "I taught her that family matters, that respect matters. If she learns nothing else from today, she'll learn that." Carla searched his face for doubt. She found none, only conviction, and it frightened her more than anger ever could. Michael Hayes approached cautiously, posture deferential. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted this to become public." Daniel turned to him. "You did your job," he said. "I'll handle the fallout." Michael hesitated. "There will be questions, legal ones, reputational." "I'm prepared," Daniel replied, and he meant it. Around them, guests whispered in clusters, some already leaving, others lingering as if hoping for a resolution that might justify staying. What remained of the ceremony felt hollow. Decorations framed an absence. Chairs faced a future that no longer matched the plan. Daniel stood alone now, separated from Carla, from Isabel, from the life he believed he was preserving. He told himself this was necessary. That discipline sometimes looked like cruelty to those unwilling to accept it. But as he watched the room slowly empty, a quiet truth settled in. This wasn't a lesson that ended today. Somewhere down the hall, Isabel sat on the floor, dress bunched around her, staring at nothing. Jack knelt beside her, saying nothing now, knowing words would only make it worse. And between father and daughter, a line had been crossed, one neither of them yet knew how or if it could ever be erased. The story traveled faster than Isabel ever imagined it could. By the next morning, phones buzzed with messages disguised as concern and sharpened by curiosity. Family group chats flared to life. Friends of friends reached out with awkward sympathy. What had happened at the wedding became a version of itself, with every retelling details bent, motives assigned, blame redistributed. By noon, it was no longer private. It was spectacle. Isabel shut herself inside her apartment. Curtains drawn, phone face down on the table like a threat. Her wedding dress lay crumpled in the corner, still tagged, still unused for the purpose it had been chosen for. Every time she thought about it, humiliation rose hot in her chest. "He ruined everything," she said to Jack, voice hoarse. "Not just the wedding, my future, my life." Jack didn't argue. He listened as she replayed the moment again and again, her father's calm voice, the stares, the silence that followed. Each repetition deepened her certainty that this hadn't been about love. It had been about control, about reminding her that even on the day meant to free her, Daniel still had the power to take everything away. Carla watched the fallout unfold with a knot in her stomach. Relatives called her first, not Daniel. Some asked gently if he was all right. Others didn't bother hiding their judgment. She found herself explaining, deflecting, softening the edges of what had happened, trying to preserve some shred of dignity for everyone involved. But when she spoke to Isabel, the conversation fractured immediately. "I can't believe you're defending him," Isabel said coldly. "I'm not," Carla replied, tears filling her eyes. "I'm trying to hold this family together." Isabel hung up. Carla sat alone afterward, realizing with a sick clarity that standing between them was no longer possible. Any loyalty she showed to Daniel felt like betrayal to her daughter. Any sympathy for Isabel felt like condemnation of her husband. The balance she had spent years maintaining had finally collapsed. Daniel, meanwhile, remained unreachable by choice. He read the messages he received but didn't respond. Condemnation didn't surprise him. Support, when it came, arrived quietly from an uncle who admired his firmness, a cousin who believed children had forgotten respect. Others were less kind. They accused him of cruelty, of ego, of turning love into leverage. He accepted all of it without reaction. Isabel's silence was louder than anything else. Days passed, then a week. No calls, no texts. When Carla mentioned Isabel's name, Daniel said nothing. Not because it didn't hurt, but because acknowledging it felt like concession. "She'll come around," he said once, though there was no certainty in his voice. Only resolve. Isabel, for her part, made her decision clear. She blocked his number, returned unopened letters. When asked about her father, she spoke of him in the past tense, as if he were already gone. The family fractured along invisible lines. Dinners went unattended. Holidays became complicated. Some relatives avoided the topic entirely. Others couldn't stop dissecting it. Daniel noticed who stayed close and who drifted away. He cataloged it silently, the way he always had. Late one night, he sat alone in his study, staring at a photo of Isabel as a child, laughing, fearless, arms wrapped around his neck. He didn't reach for it. He didn't turn it face down either. He knew what he had lost. He also knew why he had chosen it. The damage couldn't be undone. The shame couldn't be recalled. But in Daniel's mind, allowing defiance to go unanswered would have cost him something even greater. And as Isabel erased him from her life, Daniel Richards remained convinced of one thing: this story wasn't finished yet. Silence became Isabel's weapon. Days turned into weeks, with no calls, no replies, no acknowledgement that her parents existed at all. Messages went unread. Voicemails expired unheard. She didn't announce the distance, she enforced it. And in that absence, she reclaimed a sense of control she felt had been stolen from her in front of everyone she loved. Carla tried anyway. She sent gentle texts at first, short ones, neutral ones. "I'm thinking of you. I hope you're okay." When those failed, she tried calling. The phone rang until it didn't. Each attempt left her feeling smaller, as if reaching out only widened the distance. Isabel's anger had hardened into something immovable, and Carla could feel herself pushing against a wall that refused to yield. Daniel noticed the silence immediately. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that Isabel needed time. That space would cool what confrontation had ignited. But as days passed without a word, the weight settled in. He carried it quietly, refusing to let it show. Outwardly, nothing changed. He kept his routines. He spoke calmly. He made no apologies. Inside, the questions began. Had he gone too far? Had this crossed a line that couldn't be walked back? He dismissed the doubts as weakness. He reminded himself why he'd acted years of being sidelined, dismissed, reduced to an inconvenience in his own family. He hadn't acted out of impulse, he'd acted out of accumulation. And yet, silence had a way of stripping certainty down to its rawest form. Jack tried to be the bridge. He met with Carla once, then Daniel separately, offering measured words, careful suggestions. He encouraged patience. He encouraged conversation. He encouraged compromise without promising results. But every attempt to reach Isabel ended the same way, with a door closed before it could even open. "She won't listen to me either," Jack admitted one evening, voice tight. "Not about him. Not about any of it." Carla felt something in her fracture then. She'd been holding everyone together for so long that she didn't realize how thin she'd become. She cried in private now, slept less, spoke softer. Her loyalty to Daniel felt like betrayal of her daughter. Her concern for Isabel felt like abandonment of her husband. There was no position left that didn't cost her something. Daniel watched Carla struggle and felt a flicker of guilt he didn't know what to do with. He wanted to comfort her, but doing so felt like admitting fault, and he wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. At night, when the house was quiet, Daniel replayed moments he hadn't allowed himself to examine before. Isabel's face, when she saw him at the ceremony. The shock, the hurt beneath the anger. He wondered if she would ever hear his intentions beyond his methods. The thought that this might be permanent crept in slowly, uninvited. He had believed authority would bring resolution. Instead, it had brought distance. And for the first time, Daniel considered the possibility that this wasn't a standoff he could outlast. Isabel, on the other side of the silence, told herself she was done, that cutting him off was the only way to heal. Still, his absence lingered heavy, unresolved, impossible to fully escape. Neither reached out, and with each passing day, the space between father and daughter widened, no longer filled with anger, but something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Isabel didn't just withdraw from her father. She withdrew from everyone. Messages from relatives went unanswered. Invitations were declined without explanation. Friends who tried to check in were met with short replies that closed conversations as quickly as they opened. The silence wasn't loud or dramatic, it was deliberate. Emotional distance became the only space where Isabel felt safe, where no one could tell her how she should feel or what she owed anyone. Carla tried again, despite everything. She drove to Isabel's apartment one afternoon, unannounced, hoping proximity might soften what words could not. Isabel opened the door only far enough to see who it was. The look on her face wasn't anger anymore. It was exhaustion. "I can't do this today," Isabel said quietly. "I just want to talk," Carla replied, voice trembling. "Not about your father. About you." Isabel shook her head. "Everything comes back to him." The door closed gently, but the finality of it hit Carla harder than if it had been slammed. She sat in her car afterward, hands gripping the steering wheel, realizing she didn't know how to reach her daughter anymore. At home, Daniel watched the house grow quieter. No sudden arguments, no interruptions, just absence. He told himself he had anticipated this. That emotional fallout was inevitable when boundaries were enforced. But watching Carla unravel made it harder to maintain that certainty. He still believed he'd been justified. He believed respect mattered, that allowing Isabel to erase him would have set a precedent he couldn't live with. And yet, belief didn't stop the sadness from creeping in. He began noticing small things: how Carla lingered over old photos, how she flinched whenever the phone rang. He noticed himself listening for footsteps that never came. Jack tried once more. He invited Isabel to coffee, framing it as neutral ground. No agendas, no family politics. She showed up late, stayed 10 minutes, and left without finishing her drink. "I'm done talking about him," she said flatly. "And I'm done talking to people who want me to forgive something that hasn't even been acknowledged." Jack watched her walk away, feeling the futility settle in. He had wanted to help. Instead, he felt complicit in a silence that was hardening by the day. Carla began to lose hope. She stopped making calls that went unanswered, stopped drafting messages she never sent. The emotional energy required to stand between her husband and daughter had finally run out. Loving both had cost her more than she knew how to give. Daniel felt the shift in her. One evening, as they sat in separate rooms, he asked quietly, "Do you think she'll ever speak to us again?" Carla didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice broke. "I don't know." That uncertainty lodged itself in Daniel's chest. He had expected resistance. He had not expected erasure. Late that night, alone in his study, Daniel allowed himself to ask the question he'd avoided. Was it worth it? He had taught Isabel a lesson. Yes. But lessons meant nothing if the student walked away forever. He stared at the closed door, at the silence that now defined his family, and realized authority offered no comfort when there was no one left to enforce it on. Isabel lay awake that same night, staring at her ceiling, telling herself this distance was necessary. Still, the isolation pressed in, heavy and unrelenting. Father and daughter, separated by pride and pain, stood on opposite sides of a widening divide, each convinced the other should move first, and neither willing to reach across it. Daniel Richards wasn't expecting Jack. The receptionist announced him hesitantly, as if unsure whether the name would be welcome. Daniel considered refusing the meeting, then waved her off. Avoidance had already cost him enough. Jack entered the office with none of his usual ease. His shoulders were tight, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't sit right away, as if still deciding how much ground he was willing to give. "Thank you for seeing me," Jack said. Daniel gestured toward the chair. "Say what you came to say." Jack took a breath. What happened at the wedding didn't end there. It fractured everything. Isabel barely speaks to anyone now. Not even me, some days. Daniel leaned back, fingers steepled. "That wasn't my intention." "No," Jack said carefully. "But it was the result." Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken blame. Jack continued, choosing his words with restraint. "I need to understand something. Do you believe what you did was justified, even knowing what it's done to her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked past Jack, out the window, at a city that continued moving without regard for private wreckage. "I don't regret standing my ground," he said. "I regret that it came to this." "That sounds like the same thing," Jack replied quietly. Daniel turned back. "It's not. Regret implies I would undo it. I wouldn't. But I won't pretend the damage doesn't exist." Jack studied him now, seeing something beneath the authority fatigue, maybe even doubt. "She feels like you chose control over her," Jack said. "Like you proved a point and lost a daughter." Daniel flinched, just slightly. "I didn't choose control," he said. "I chose to be acknowledged." Jack nodded. "Then acknowledge her now. Reach out. Let her speak without consequence." Daniel exhaled slowly. "And if she demands an apology, maybe she deserves one," Jack said. Daniel's voice hardened. "I won't apologize for refusing to be erased." Jack leaned forward. "Then don't. Apologize for the pain. There's a difference." The words landed harder than Jack intended. Daniel said nothing. Jack pressed on. "I can help arrange a meeting. Neutral ground, no audience, just the two of you. You might not get another chance." After Jack left, Carla came in quietly. She had overheard enough to know what had been discussed. "He's right," she said softly. "Not about everything, but about this." Daniel rubbed his temples. "I won't beg." "I'm not asking you to," Carla replied. "I'm asking you not to let pride decide whether you have a daughter." The room felt smaller then. Daniel thought of Isabel as a child, sitting across from him at the dinner table. Stubborn even then, eyes locked on his whenever she refused to back down. He had admired that fire once. Now it threatened to burn the last bridge between them. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. Carla placed a hand on his arm. "Readiness isn't guaranteed. Loss is." Daniel was left alone with the decision. Reaching out meant risk rejection, confrontation, vulnerability. Not reaching out meant certainty, a silence that would harden into permanence. As he stared at his phone, Daniel realized this choice would define what came next. And somewhere, Isabel remained unaware that the first crack in the silence had finally begun to form. The message came late at night. Daniel stared at his phone for a long moment before opening it, as if the words might change if he waited long enough. "We need to talk," Isabel had written. "Not to fix anything, just to say what hasn't been said." His first instinct was caution. Too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done. Conversations like this didn't heal, they exposed. But beneath the hesitation was something else. Relief. The silence, however deserved, had become unbearable. "Where?" he replied. They met 2 days later at a quiet cafe halfway between their homes. Neutral ground. No witnesses who mattered. Isabel arrived first, seated rigidly, hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She didn't stand when Daniel walked in. She didn't smile. He sat across from her, noting how different she looked, tired, guarded, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Say what you came to say," Isabel said immediately, voice sharp with restraint. Daniel nodded. "You reached out." She let out a humorless laugh. "Don't mistake that for forgiveness." "I won't," he replied. The dam broke quickly. "You ruined my wedding," Isabel said, the words spilling out with years of force behind them. "You didn't just embarrass me, you took something I can never get back. That was supposed to be mine. One day where I wasn't fighting you." Daniel absorbed the blow without interruption. "You didn't give me a choice," she continued. "You stripped away my control, my independence, just to prove you still had power over me." "That's not what I was doing," Daniel said calmly. "It's exactly what you were doing," Isabel shot back. "You've done it my entire life." She leaned forward now, eyes blazing. "Every decision I made felt like a test I was failing. Careers, relationships, even who I was allowed to be. I was always shrinking to fit your expectations." Daniel's hands tightened around his cup. "I pushed because I was afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid that if I didn't matter, I wouldn't exist to you at all." Isabel froze, unprepared for the admission. "You shut me out long before the wedding," Daniel continued. "Years of distance, polite conversations, being tolerated instead of included. The wedding wasn't the beginning, it was the confirmation. So you punished me for it," she said. "I demanded to be acknowledged," he replied. "There's a difference." Isabel shook her head, tears finally breaking through. "You don't get to demand love or respect. Not like that." Daniel swallowed. "I know. And I know I've been overbearing, controlling. I won't deny it anymore." The words felt foreign on his tongue. "I didn't trust myself as a father," he admitted. "I didn't trust that you'd come back if I loosened my grip. So I held tighter, and I drove you away." Isabel's breathing slowed, anger giving way to something heavier. "I never stopped wanting you in my life," she said. "I just wanted you to see me, not manage me." Silence stretched between them, fragile but real. Daniel looked at her not as an adversary, not as a child to correct, but as a woman carrying wounds he had helped create. "I was afraid of losing you," he said, "and I acted like fear was authority." There was no apology. Not yet. And Isabel didn't offer forgiveness. But something shifted. The conversation didn't end with resolution. It ended with understanding, partial, painful, unfinished. They stood to leave without knowing what came next, only that the silence between them had finally been broken. As Daniel watched Isabel walk away, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because now that the truth was spoken, neither of them could pretend the damage or the possibility of healing didn't exist. Daniel spent the night after meeting Isabel awake, not restless alert. His mind returned again and again to her words, to the way anger had finally cracked into honesty. For the first time in years, he wasn't rehearsing arguments or justifications. He was measuring loss, years of distance, missed moments. The quiet rejection he had pretended didn't hurt. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about forgetting what she'd done. It was about deciding whether the pain would define what came next. Carla found him at the kitchen table before dawn, coffee untouched. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She already knew. "She reached out," Carla said softly. "That matters. It doesn't erase everything," Daniel replied. "No," Carla agreed. "But it opens a door." Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive her. Not fully. Being shut out of her life, of her wedding, felt like being buried while still breathing." Carla's eyes filled. "And what do you think it felt like for her?" The question lingered. "I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't hurt," Carla continued. "I'm asking you not to let it be the end." Daniel said nothing. The truth was, bitterness had become familiar. Letting go of it felt like another risk, one he wasn't sure he could survive if it failed. Across town, Isabel paced her living room, replaying the conversation from every angle. The anger was still there, but it no longer stood alone. Guilt crept in around the edges, unwelcome but persistent. "I don't know if I went too far," she admitted to Jack. "Cutting him off, pretending he didn't exist." Jack listened carefully. "You were protecting yourself, or punishing him," Isabel said quietly. Jack leaned forward. "Both can be true. But if you want something different, someone has to move first. Isabel stared at the floor. What if it's too late? Then at least you'll know you tried, Jack said. Back at home, Carla finally voiced what she'd been holding back. Forgiveness doesn't mean you were wrong, she told Daniel. It means you're willing to stop bleeding from the same wound. Daniel looked at her, exhaustion etched deep. What if I forgive her and she leaves again? Carla swallowed. Then you'll have loved her without conditions. That has to count for something. The house felt suspended in time, every room carrying echoes of arguments and laughter alike. Daniel thought of Isabel as a child, then as a stranger, then as the woman he'd faced in that cafe. He wondered which version he was willing to let define their future. Neither side had made a move yet. Isabel drafted a message she didn't send. Daniel picked up his phone and set it back down. Carla watched both of them from the middle, knowing this pause couldn't last forever. They stood at a crossroads where pride and healing diverged, each path demanding a different kind of courage. And whichever choice came next would decide whether this family moved forward together or finally permanently apart. The truth didn't come out all at once. It surfaced the way secrets usually do, carelessly, almost accidentally, when everyone was already too raw to absorb another wound. Jack let it slip during a conversation that was supposed to be about healing, about moving forward. I didn't think it would end like this, he said quietly. Daniel looked up. End like what? Jack hesitated. Long enough. You knew, Daniel said, the realization snapping into place. You knew this was coming. Silence answered him. Daniel stood slowly, the air shifting around them. You knew about the confrontation, he said. Before the wedding. Jack didn't deny it. I encouraged her to stand her ground, he admitted. I thought it was time she stopped backing down. The words landed harder than any accusation. Daniel felt something cold spread through his chest, not anger at first, but betrayal. You sat in my office, he said, voice low. You spoke about neutrality, about peace, and all the while, you were pushing her toward a collision. Jack swallowed. I thought you'd back off. Isabel, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped in sharply. What did you say? Jack turned to her, face tight. I told you not to let him intimidate you. I told you the wedding was your line in the sand. Her eyes widened. You let me believe this was just between me and him. I was trying to protect you, Jack said. No. Isabel shot back. You were steering me. The argument ignited instantly. You watched me implode, Isabel said, voice rising. You watched my family tear itself apart, and you never said a word. Jack's restraint cracked. Because you needed to break free. He controlled everything. I thought once you stood up to him, things would reset. Instead, you pushed me into a war, she said. One I wasn't ready for. Daniel watched them with a growing sense of disbelief. Pieces rearranged themselves in his mind, the timing, the confidence Isabel had shown. Jack's careful positioning as the reasonable one. What he had seen as defiance now looked disturbingly like influence. So, this marriage, Daniel said quietly, began with manipulation. Jack turned toward him. That's not fair, isn't it? Daniel replied. You encouraged her to provoke a man you knew wouldn't back down. Then you stood aside while everything burned. Jack ran a hand through his hair. I miscalculated. I didn't think it would go public. I didn't think you'd go that far. Isabel felt the weight of it all crash down at once. The confrontation, the fallout, the silence. She had told herself she'd acted alone, that this was her choice. Now, she wasn't so sure. You let me believe I was reclaiming my power, she said softly. But you never told me you were guiding the fight. Jack stepped closer. I love you. I just wanted you free. Free. The word felt hollow. Daniel turned away, unable to look at either of them. The betrayal cut deeper now, not just as a father, but as a man who had trusted Jack's calm reason during the chaos. If this is how you handle conflict, Daniel said, I don't know what kind of foundation this marriage stands on. Isabel sank into a chair, head in her hands. The certainty she'd built her independence on began to crack. Had she pushed her father away because she needed space, or because someone had nudged her toward the edge? The room fell silent, thick with realization. Nothing had been as simple as anyone wanted to believe. And as Isabel looked from her father to her fiancé, one terrifying question took hold. Had she traded one form of control for another? The truth left wreckage behind it. After Jack's confession, nothing settled the way anyone expected. It didn't bring clarity or relief. It reopened wounds Daniel and Isabel had barely begun to examine. The fragile understanding they'd reached now sat under the weight of a new betrayal, and both of them struggled to find their footing again. Isabel barely looked at her father at first. Her focus turned inward, replaying every conversation she'd had with Jack in the months leading up to the wedding. Every encouraging word, every moment he'd framed resistance as strength. The realization that her decisions hadn't been entirely her own felt like a theft of agency, of trust. "I need time," she said finally, voice hollow. Jack tried to explain himself, to reframe his actions as misguided love rather than manipulation. Isabel cut him off mid-sentence. "I can't hear you right now," she said. "Everything you say feels like another angle." The words landed hard. Jack fell silent, watching the distance between them widen, unsure how to close it without making things worse. Daniel stood apart from it all, his instinct to intervene fighting against a deeper understanding that had begun to take shape. For once, he didn't step in. He didn't correct, instruct, or demand. He waited. Watching Isabel grapple with the truth stirred something uncomfortable in him recognition. He saw in her the same stubborn determination that had once driven him, the same refusal to be guided once trust was broken. He realized then that forcing his presence had never been the solution. Allowing her to choose wrongly, painfully, independently was the part he had avoided. Carla tried to hold everyone together, but the effort was crushing. She moved between rooms, conversations, silences, offering comfort where she could and absorbing blame where she couldn't. Each side pulled at her, and she felt herself thinning under the strain. "I don't know where I'm supposed to stand anymore," she admitted one evening, voice cracking. Daniel took her hand but said nothing. There were no answers left that wouldn't hurt someone. Isabel began to see her father differently, not as the architect of her humiliation, but as a man who had acted out of fear and love twisted together. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it complicated it. And in that complication, a small shift occurred. "I don't forgive him," she told Carla quietly, "but I don't think he was trying to destroy me." Carla nodded, tears in her eyes. "That's more than where we were." Jack, meanwhile, grew increasingly defensive, frustrated that his explanations were dismissed. "I was trying to help," he insisted. "You're making me the villain because it's easier." Isabel turned away. "You made yourself one." Daniel listened from a distance, feeling the sting of the words meant for another man. He understood now that control, even when motivated by love, was still control. And if he wanted any chance of rebuilding what he'd broken, he would have to relinquish it. "I can't manage this anymore," he said to Carla later. "I have to let her figure it out." That admission marked a turning point. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but restraint. The family moved through the days that followed carefully, as if walking over fractured ground. No one knew what could bear weight and what would give way without warning. Jack and Isabel existed in uneasy proximity. Daniel and Isabel in cautious distance. Carla in the middle, exhausted and uncertain. The aftershock hadn't destroyed them yet, but as each of them stared at the damage left behind, one question lingered, unanswered and heavy. Was there anything left solid enough to rebuild on? Isabel didn't rush the decision. She sat with it for days, turning over every memory, every sharp word, every silence that followed. Pride had carried her far, far enough to burn bridges she hadn't meant to destroy. When she finally reached for her phone, her hands shook, not with anger this time, but with resolve. "Can we talk?" she wrote. Daniel answered almost immediately. Yes. They met at his house, not in a cafe or office, but in the space where most of the damage had quietly taken root. Isabel stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, taking in the familiar walls as if seeing them for the first time. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm here to say I'm sorry." Daniel nodded, motioning for her to sit. He didn't interrupt. He didn't brace himself. He listened. "I acted out of pride," Isabel continued, voice steady but fragile. "I told myself I was standing up for myself, but I was also punishing you. I wanted you to feel the rejection I felt growing up." The admission landed heavily. "I didn't understand how much that would cost us," she said, "or how deeply it would hurt you." Daniel felt the words settle slowly, cutting through years of resentment. He heard sincerity, not desperation, not strategy, just truth. I still believe I needed space, Isabel said. But I should have handled it differently. I shouldn't have erased you. Daniel exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in months. Thank you for saying that, he replied quietly. He paused, then continued. I failed you in ways I didn't want to see. I confused guidance with control, love with authority. And I'm sorry for that. The room felt still, but not empty. I was afraid, Daniel admitted. Afraid that if I stopped pushing, I'd lose you completely. And in trying to prevent that, I almost guaranteed it. Isabel's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. I don't want us to be strangers. Neither do I, Daniel said. Jack arrived later, invited but hesitant. He stood awkwardly until Isabel gestured for him to sit. I owe you both an apology, Jack said. What I did was wrong. I thought I was helping, but I crossed a line. I won't make decisions for either of you again. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Intent doesn't erase impact, he said. But accountability matters. Jack met his gaze. I want to earn back your trust. Both of you. The conversation didn't erase the past. It didn't resolve every fear or guarantee peace. But something essential shifted. The walls lowered just enough for light to get in. We're not fixed, Isabel said quietly. No, Daniel agreed. But we're talking. They sat together for a while after that, not filling the space with promises, just allowing it to exist without tension. For the first time since the wedding, the silence didn't feel like punishment. As Isabel stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring. Boundaries still needed to be rebuilt. Trust still needed time. But as the door closed gently behind her, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. And for the first time, that felt like enough to begin again. Progress came quietly, not with declarations or sudden closeness, but with small, careful exchanges that felt almost tentative. Daniel and Isabel spoke more often now, though rarely about the past directly. Conversations stayed measured, respectful, as if both were aware how easily one wrong word could reopen old wounds. There was warmth returning, but distance too, a reminder that trust, once damaged, didn't rush back simply because it was invited. Daniel found himself reflecting more than he ever had before. He looked back on years he'd mistaken authority for stability, control for care. He saw now how often he'd spoken over fear instead of acknowledging it, how miscommunication had hardened into habit. Letting go of that instinct felt unnatural, almost dangerous. But he was learning that listening didn't weaken him. It required a different kind of strength. Carla carried the family forward in ways no one else noticed. She checked in quietly, never pushing, always watching for signs of strain. She celebrated small improvements without demanding more. To Isabel, she offered reassurance. To Daniel, perspective. And in the spaces between, she absorbed the emotional weight neither of them could fully carry yet. It exhausted her, but she didn't step away. Isabel began to soften in ways that surprised even her. She still guarded her independence, still flinched at reminders of the wedding. But she spoke more openly now about her fears, about how fighting her father had once felt like the only way to breathe. Hearing Daniel acknowledge his role, not defensively, not conditionally, changed something in her. It didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it. I don't think either of us knew how to stop, she admitted one evening. Daniel nodded. I'm learning now. Jack and Isabel took their own steps forward. Therapy wasn't easy. Conversations uncovered uncomfortable truths about influence, avoidance, and how quickly love could slide into control when fear took the wheel. Jack owned his mistakes openly, without justification. Isabel listened, cautious but present. Their marriage didn't reset, it recalibrated. For Daniel, vulnerability became the hardest adjustment. He was used to being the fixed point, the one others leaned on. Allowing himself to be uncertain, emotionally available, without armor, felt exposed. But each time he resisted the urge to direct or correct, he felt the shift. Less tension, more space. The family gathered occasionally now. Short dinners, neutral topics, shared laughter that still surprised them. No one pretended the past didn't exist. They simply stopped letting it dominate every moment. Healing didn't arrive as closure. It arrived as permission to move slowly, to fail safely, to rebuild without guarantees. There were still days when Isabel pulled back, when Daniel caught himself slipping into old patterns, when Carla wondered how long she could keep balancing everyone's needs. But there were also days that felt lighter. Days when conversation didn't feel like negotiation, when silence felt peaceful instead of punitive. The road ahead wasn't smooth, it wasn't certain, but it was open. And for a family that had nearly torn itself apart, that felt like a beginning worth protecting. Isabel stopped running from the past, the day she finally named it. She sat alone in her apartment, sunlight cutting across the floor, and acknowledged what she had avoided for months, that pushing Daniel out hadn't just been about independence. It had been about control of a different kind. By cutting him off completely, she'd isolated herself from more than a father. She'd severed a support system she hadn't realized she still needed. Taking responsibility didn't mean surrendering her autonomy. It meant owning the consequences of how she'd exercised it. When she said as much to Daniel, he didn't interrupt, he didn't defend himself or rush to correct her framing. He listened, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, not dramatically, but permanently. Later, Daniel sat with Carla at the kitchen table, the same place where so many of their hardest conversations had unfolded. "We're not parents the way we used to be," he said. More observation than regret. Carla nodded. "We don't get to decide her life anymore. We get to be part of it if she lets us." Daniel considered that. For years, his identity had been tied to guidance, authority, provision. Letting go of that structure felt like stepping into unfamiliar terrain, but he saw now that adapting didn't mean disappearing. It meant changing the term. Jack and Isabel felt the difference too. They spoke more honestly than they ever had before, about fear, about influence, about how easily love could turn into leverage when neither wanted to lose ground. Their closeness deepened not because conflict vanished, but because it was finally named without blame. Respect became the foundation where power once sat. Daniel and Isabel began to define a new rhythm. He offered advice only when asked. He checked his instincts before acting on them. And Isabel, sensing the shift, found herself less defensive. She shared more not because she was obligated, but because she wanted to. The balance felt fragile, but real. Carla noticed the changes in the quiet moments. A shared meal without tension. A laugh that came easily instead of cautiously. A phone call that ended with warmth instead of exhaustion. She still carried the weight of what had been lost, but it no longer pressed as heavily on her chest. They started small. Sunday dinners returned. Short walks. Conversations about nothing important at all. Each ordinary moment became a stitch in something being carefully repaired. No one rushed it. No one pretended the fabric wasn't delicate. One evening, as they sat together watching the light fade outside the window, Isabel leaned back and said softly, "I don't want us to go back to how things were." Daniel nodded. "Neither do I." What they were building wasn't a return, it was a revision. The future remained uncertain. Trust still required maintenance. Forgiveness still demanded effort. But the family was no longer defined by rupture. They were defined by choice. And as they prepared for the days ahead quietly, without ceremony, there was a shared understanding that whatever came next would be faced together, shaped not by control or defiance, but by respect hard-won and carefully kept. They walked without urgency. A quiet path stretched ahead of them, bordered by early autumn trees just beginning to turn. Leaves shifted underfoot with a soft, steady rhythm that matched their pace. Daniel and Isabel didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt like a weapon, it felt earned. "I never thought we'd get here," Isabel said eventually. Daniel nodded. "Neither did I." They stopped briefly, looking out over the water beyond the path. It reflected the sky imperfectly, broken by ripples. Daniel found himself thinking how fitting that felt. "We hurt each other," he said. "Deeply, yes," Isabel replied. "But we learned too." Daniel took a slow breath. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's uncomfortable. It forces you to sit with things you'd rather bury. But it's the only way to heal. And healing isn't something you finish. It's something you keep choosing." Isabel absorbed that quietly. She had spent so long seeing his actions as pure control that she'd missed the fear underneath the fear of becoming irrelevant, of losing his place in her life entirely. That didn't excuse the damage, but it explained it. "I see it differently now," she said. "Not as an excuse, just context." Daniel met her gaze. "That's all I ever hoped for." They resumed walking, steps naturally falling into sync. Isabel felt the weight of her own choices settled not as shame, but responsibility. "I wanted independence so badly," she said. "I didn't realize how recklessly I chased it. I thought cutting you out was strength. I see now how much it hurt everyone." Daniel listened, resisting the urge to reassure too quickly. This wasn't about absolution. It was about honesty. The family wasn't whole in the way it once had been. It was different now. Boundaries clearer, expectations quieter, communication slower, more deliberate. Carla had named it best growth, didn't erase scars, but it taught you how to live with them without reopening the wound. Daniel noticed the small things now. Isabel reaching out first, asking instead of assuming, laughing without tension. They weren't dramatic shifts. They were subtle, steady, real. "I'm proud of you," he said. Isabel looked surprised, then smiled. "That means more than you know." They reached the end of the path and turned back, the future no longer feeling like something to brace against. Daniel knew trust would still need time, that some days would be harder than others. But he had learned something essential: authority couldn't force connection. Only presence could. As they walked, side by side, Daniel felt a quiet certainty take hold. Not that everything was fixed, but that something lasting had been built. And together, without rushing or looking back, Daniel and Isabel walked into the future, their relationship stronger than before, shaped by forgiveness, understanding, and a renewed commitment to each other.